Almost every day, somewhere on Earth, two countries that have nothing to do with the United States trade with each other, and they do it in US dollars. A Korean company buys oil from Saudi Arabia, priced in dollars. A German bank lends to a Brazilian firm, often in dollars. Roughly half of all international trade is invoiced in a currency belonging to a country responsible for about a tenth of that trade. This is the strangest, quietest kind of power there is. So how did green pieces of paper from one nation end up running the entire planet's economy? To answer that, we have to go back to a time when the dollar was nobody. Chapter 1. A world that ran on gold and on Britain. For most of the 1800s and right up to the First World War, the most important currency on Earth was not the dollar. It was the British pound sterling. At its peak, the British Empire covered about a quarter of the planet's land and people, and the pound came with it. If you were financing a railway in Argentina, a shipment of tea from India, or a cotton deal in Egypt, the contract was very often written in pounds, cleared through a bank in London. The City of London was the financial capital of the world, and sterling was the language money spoke. And the reason everyone trusted the pound comes down to one shiny metal, gold. Under what's called the classical gold standard, a currency was just a claim on a fixed amount of gold sitting in a vault. The deal was simple. Bring your paper pounds to the Bank of England, and they would hand you gold at a fixed rate, no questions asked. Every major currency was defined this way, which meant exchange rates between them barely moved. Money was, in effect, just gold wearing different national costumes. It was stable, it was predictable, and it was about to be blown apart. Now, here's the strange part. By the early 1900s, the United States was already the largest economy in the world. It outproduced Britain in steel, in coal, in just about everything, and yet the dollar was a financial nobody, barely used outside America's own borders. There wasn't even a proper central bank to manage it until the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, so America had the muscle of a giant, but the financial reputation of a teenager. Economic size alone, it turns out, is not enough to make a currency rule the world. You need something more. You need trust, and you need a crisis. History was about to supply both. In 1914, the First World War arrived, and the gold standard was one of its first casualties. Fighting a modern war is staggeringly expensive, and no country could pay for shells and battleships in actual gold, so they did the thing the gold standard was designed to prevent. They printed. Europe's great powers suspended convertibility, ran up enormous debts, and shipped huge quantities of their gold across the Atlantic to pay for American food, weapons, and supplies. The war didn't just redraw borders. It quietly moved the world's gold, and it nearly all moved to one place. The United States sold to everyone and owed almost nobody. By the end of the Second World War, America's vaults held an astonishing share of all the monetary gold on Earth, by many estimates, close to 2/3 of it. The country that had started the century as a debtor to Europe ended it as the planet's banker, creditor, and arsenal, all at once. So picture the situation in 1944. Europe and Asia are physically destroyed. Their treasuries are empty, their currencies are shattered, and their gold is sitting in New York. The United States is producing roughly half of everything the world makes. Whoever holds the gold makes the rules, and the world was about to sit down and write new ones. Chapter 2. The meeting that crowned the dollar. In July 1944, while the war was still being fought, delegates from 44 nations checked into a hotel in the mountains of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their job was to design the financial system for the world that would exist once the shooting stopped. They were haunted by the 1930s, a decade of crashing currencies, trade walls, and beggar-thee neighbor devaluations that had helped tip the world into depression and then war. They wanted stability. What they built would make the US dollar the center of gravity for the global economy for the next 80 years. But there was a fight over how to do it. The British delegation was led by the most famous economist alive, John Maynard Keynes. He proposed a bold idea, a brand new global currency, which he called the Bancorp, managed by an international institution belonging to no single country. It was clever, and it was fair, and the Americans killed it. Their lead negotiator, Harry Dexter White, had a simpler plan. Why invent a neutral world currency when America already held the gold, the factories, and the leverage? The dollar would be the anchor. Britain, broke and dependent on American loans, was in no position to argue. The world's reserve currency wasn't chosen on merit. It was chosen by whoever held the gold. The plan that won was elegant. Instead of pegging every currency directly to gold, the world would peg to gold through the dollar. It worked in two layers. Layer 1. The United States promised that the dollar was convertible to gold at a fixed price, $35 an ounce. Layer 2. Every other country pegged its currency not to gold, but to the dollar. So the dollar became the hinge. It was the one currency still officially as good as gold, and everyone else's money was, in turn, as good as dollars. The greenback was now the sun. The whole system orbited. Bretton Woods also created two institutions you've definitely heard of. The International Monetary Fund was set up as a kind of emergency lender, a pool of money that countries could borrow from if their currency got into trouble, so they wouldn't have to devalue or default in a panic. And the World Bank was built to finance reconstruction and later, development. Both were headquartered in Washington. Both by design kept the dollar at the center of everything. For a while, it worked beautifully. The 1950s and 60s saw an explosion of global trade and one of the longest economic booms in history. Stable exchange rates meant businesses could plan, invest, and trade across borders without betting on wild currency swings. The dollar wasn't just American money anymore. It had become the world's measuring stick, but hidden inside this perfect system was a contradiction, and one economist saw it coming. His name was Robert Triffin, and in 1960 he pointed out the trap. The world was growing, and a growing world needed more and more dollars to trade and to hold as reserves. The only way to get those dollars out into the world was for the United States to spend more abroad than it took in, to run permanent deficits. But the more dollars piled up overseas, the less believable America's promise to swap every one of them for gold became. This became known as the Triffin dilemma, and it's the key to this entire story, so hold on to it. To supply the world with its money, America had to flood the world with dollars. But flooding the world with dollars was exactly the thing that would eventually make people doubt the dollar. The system, in other words, was designed to undermine itself. It just needed time. Chapter 3. The day the gold window slammed shut. By the 1960s, time was running out. The United States was spending heavily on the Vietnam War abroad and on ambitious social programs at home, and it was paying for a lot of it by printing dollars. Those dollars flowed out into the world exactly as Triffin had predicted. Meanwhile, the amount of gold sitting in Fort Knox stayed roughly the same, so you had a rising mountain of dollars held by foreigners, sitting on top of a fixed and increasingly small pile of American gold. At some point, the arithmetic became impossible to ignore. The dollars held outside the United States quietly grew larger than all the gold America actually had to back them. The promise, "Bring us a dollar, we'll give you gold," was still officially true. But it was now a promise the United States could not possibly keep if everyone asked at once. It was, in effect, a bank running on trust with not enough gold in the vault. For a while, the major economies tried to hold the line together. In the 1960s, they pooled their gold reserves in something called the London Gold Pool, quietly selling bullion to keep the price pinned at $35 an ounce and stop a panic. But it was like bailing out a boat with a bigger and bigger hole in it. Demand for gold kept rising. Confidence kept slipping, and by 1968, the effort collapsed. The market price of gold began to float free, drifting above the official rate. That gap was the financial world quietly admitting a truth nobody wanted to say out loud. The dollar was no longer really worth its weight in gold, and some countries decided to act on that truth. France, led by Charles de Gaulle, decided to test the promise. If the dollars were supposedly as good as gold, France would simply take the gold. Through the late 1960s, the French and others began converting their dollar reserves into bullion and shipping it out of New York. It was a slow-motion bank run on the United States, and the vault was emptying. So, on the 15th of August, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television, interrupting a Sunday night movie, and changed the world. He announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The gold window was closed. Foreign governments could no longer turn their dollars into American bullion. That word, temporarily, is doing a lot of work because the window has never reopened. In one broadcast, the link between the dollar and gold that had anchored money for centuries was simply cut. At first, the world tried to patch the old system back together. A few months later, the major economies signed the Smithsonian Agreement, devaluing the dollar a little and trying to set new fixed pegs. Nixon called it the most significant monetary agreement in history. It lasted barely over a year. The pressures Triffin had identified hadn't gone anywhere. and by 1973 the patched-up pegs collapsed for good. The world's major currencies began to simply float against each other, their values set every second by markets, the way they still are today. The age of fixed money was over. The age of trust had begun. Think about what that meant. From that night in 1971 on, the dollar was backed by nothing you could hold. No gold, no silver, just the credibility of the United States government. Economists call this fiat money, from the Latin for let it be done. It has value because a government says it does, and because everyone agrees to keep using it. The entire global system had just been quietly transferred onto a foundation of pure trust. By all the old rules, this should have been the end of dollar dominance. The one thing that made the dollar special, its link to gold, was gone. Logically, the world should have started drifting toward something else. Instead, within just a few years, the dollar didn't weaken. It became even more essential. And the reason why is buried in a barrel of oil. Chapter 4. How Oil Rescued the Dollar. In 1973, the world got hit by an earthquake it didn't see coming. In response to geopolitical conflict in the Middle East, the major Arab oil producers cut output and imposed an embargo. The price of oil roughly quadrupled in a matter of months. Petrol stations ran dry, economies lurched into recession, and suddenly the countries sitting on top of the world's oil, especially Saudi Arabia, were about to become unimaginably rich. The question was, what currency would all that new oil wealth be counted in? This is where the United States made one of the shrewdest moves in economic history. In 1974, Washington struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, and the logic was beautifully simple. The United States would provide military protection and weapons to the Saudi kingdom. In return, the Saudis would sell their oil in dollars, and only dollars, and they would take the enormous profits and recycle them straight back into US government debt, into treasury bonds. Other oil producers followed. Oil, the one commodity every industrial economy on Earth absolutely must buy, was now locked to the dollar, and this quietly rebuilt the dollar's foundation. Before 1971, the dollar was backed by gold. After 1974, it was, in effect, backed by oil, or rather, by the fact that you needed dollars to buy oil. Think about the consequences. If you're Japan, or India, or Germany, and you have no oil of your own, you must buy it on the world market, and to buy it on the world market. And to buy it, you first need dollars. Every country on Earth now had a powerful, non-negotiable reason to hold and earn US currency. This is the petrodollar system, and it was a stroke of genius. The United States had replaced a backing it could run out of, gold, with a source of demand that would never run out. The world's endless thirst for energy. The dollar no longer needed gold, because now the dollar had something arguably better. It had a monopoly on the most important market on the planet. And the dollars didn't just sit still, they circled the globe. The oil states were suddenly earning more money than they could possibly spend, so they parked it in Western banks. Those banks then lent it out, often to developing countries in Latin America and Africa hungry for cash, in loans denominated in dollars. It was called petrodollar recycling, and it pulled half the planet deeper into the dollar's orbit. It also sowed the seeds of the debt crises that would hammer those same countries in the 1980s, when US interest rates shot up and those dollar debts suddenly became crushing. The dollar's reach now came with dollar-sized strings attached, and there's a deeper benefit hiding in all of this. All those profits being recycled into US Treasury bonds meant the rest of the world was now lending its money back to America, cheaply. The United States could borrow on better terms than anyone else on Earth, simply because it issued the currency everyone needed. A French finance minister had a name for this. He called it America's exorbitant privilege. We're about to get into the real machinery, how the dollar actually controls the global financial system, and why it's been so hard to dethrone. If you're finding this interesting, a subscribe genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. Okay, back to it. Chapter 5. The Anatomy of Dominance. So far we've talked about trade and oil, but the dollar's real power runs much deeper, and it shows up in something called reserve currencies. Every country keeps a rainy day fund of foreign money, reserves it can use to pay for imports, stabilize its own currency, or weather a crisis. The question is, what money do you keep in that fund? You want something stable, something everyone accepts, something you can spend anywhere. For almost every central bank on Earth, the answer is, overwhelmingly, the dollar. Here's the number that captures it. Of all the foreign currency reserves held by the world's central banks, The US dollar makes up roughly 60%. The euro, in second place, is somewhere around 20%. Everything else, the Japanese yen, the British pound, the Chinese yuan, splits what's left. No other currency is even close. When the entire world saves for emergencies, it saves, more than anything else, in dollars. But reserves are only half the story. There's a concept economists call dominant currency pricing, and it's quietly enormous. When companies around the world set prices for international trade, they overwhelmingly do it in dollars, even when neither the buyer nor the seller is American. Somewhere around half of all global trade is invoiced in dollars. Several times America's actual share of that trade. That means when the dollar's value moves, it ripples into the price of goods in countries that never see an American bill. The dollar isn't just money the world holds. It's the unit the world thinks in, and the dollar dominates the plumbing of trade itself. The dollar appears on roughly 90% of all foreign exchange transactions on the planet. Even when no American is involved, the dollar usually is, because the fastest way to swap, say, Thai baht for Chilean pesos is often to go through dollars in the middle. The dollar isn't just one currency among many. It's the connective tissue, the common language that lets all the other currencies talk to each other. Underneath all of this sits the safest, deepest financial market in the world, U.S. Treasury bonds. When a government, a company, or a giant investment fund anywhere on Earth wants somewhere to park money safely, they buy U.S. government debt. It's considered the closest thing to a risk-free asset that exists. That demand is colossal, and it lets the United States borrow trillions at low cost. The world's desire for a safe place to store money has been quietly funding the American government for decades. And here's the strangest proof of the dollar's power. In 2008, the United States caused a global financial crisis. It started in American mortgages, on Wall Street, in American banks. By every intuition, the dollar should have crashed. Instead, terrified investors around the world did the opposite. They ran toward the dollar, piling into U.S. treasuries as the safest place to hide. The dollar shot up, and the U.S. Federal Reserve ended up acting as lender to the entire planet, opening emergency dollar swap lines to other central banks to keep the world supplied with greenbacks. Even when America breaks the system, the world clings tighter to its money. That is what real dominance looks like. There's even a vast hidden layer to this. Dollars that live entirely outside the United States. Banks in London, Tokyo, and Singapore hold dollar deposits and make dollar loans without a single one of those dollars ever touching American soil. They're nicknamed Eurodollars, and the offshore dollar system is staggeringly large. The point is this: the dollar long ago stopped being something the United States fully controls. It became the world's currency, used by everyone, everywhere, including by people actively trying to avoid America. All of this creates what economists call a network effect, and it's the dollar's deepest moat. You use dollars because everyone else uses dollars. Switching would only make sense if everyone switched at once, and nobody wants to move first. It's the same reason we all still use the same keyboard layout designed over a century ago. Not because it's perfect, but because it's what everybody already uses. The dollar is the default setting of the global economy. Chapter 6, when the world's currency becomes a weapon. Here's where dominance turns into raw power. To move money across borders, banks rely on a messaging network called SWIFT. Think of it as the email system that lets banks worldwide send each other payment instructions. And because so much of global finance is conducted in dollars, those payments ultimately have to clear through the American banking system, which means the United States sits at a choke point. It can see enormous amounts of the world's money moving, and, crucially, it can decide to switch a country off. And it has. Over the past 2 decades, the United States has used access to the dollar system as a tool of foreign policy. Countries like Iran have found themselves largely cut off, frozen out of dollar clearing and from SWIFT, and the effect on their economies was severe. You don't need an army to put enormous pressure on a country when you control the financial network it depends on to sell its oil and buy its imports. Sanctions became the dollar's quiet artillery. The most dramatic demonstration came in 2022. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies did something that stunned every finance ministry on Earth. They froze the foreign reserves of the Russian central bank, roughly $300 billion of savings that Russia thought were safely in the bank, and cut major Russian institutions out of SWIFT. In effect, a chunk of one of the world's largest economies' rainy day fund was switched off, overnight, with the press of a button. For Washington, it was a show of overwhelming financial force. but it also sent a chill through capitals everywhere, including ones that are not enemies of the United States. Because the lesson every government took away was simple and unsettling: the dollars you hold are only truly yours as long as you stay on Washington's good side. And if that's true, then maybe holding all your savings in dollars isn't as safe as it looks. And this is the great paradox of dollar power. The more aggressively the United States uses the dollar as a weapon, the more it motivates the rest of the world to find a way out from under it. Every sanction is also an advertisement for an alternative. The very strength of the system is now quietly generating the demand to escape it. Which brings us to the challengers. Chapter 7. Can anything actually replace it? Let's go through the contenders. First, the euro. On paper, it's the obvious rival. It's already the world's second reserve currency, backed by one of the largest economies on Earth. But the Eurozone has a structural weakness. It's a single currency shared by many governments that don't always agree. With no unified national debt market as deep as America's treasuries, the euro is strong, but it has spent its life as a solid number 2, not a genuine challenger for the top spot. Then there's the big one, China and the yuan. China is the world's largest trading nation and second largest economy, and it desperately wants its currency to play a global role. It's built its own cross-border payment system, called CIPS, as an alternative to the Western network, and it's pushing to settle more of its trade in yuan. But there's a catch, and it's a big one. China keeps tight control over money flowing in and out of the country, and global investors don't fully trust that they can get their money out whenever they want. A reserve currency demands openness and trust, and that's exactly what Beijing is least willing to give. The most symbolic battleground is oil, the very thing that anchored the dollar in the first place. China now buys an enormous share of the world's oil, including from Saudi Arabia, and for years there's been talk of a petro-yuan, oil priced and paid for in Chinese currency. If the Saudis ever truly broke from pricing oil in dollars, it would be the loudest possible signal that the petrodollar era was ending. So far, it's been mostly talk and small experiments. But the fact that the conversation is happening at all, between America's old oil partner and its biggest rival, would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Then there's the broader de-dollarization movement, often associated with the BRICS group: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanding to include others. The idea is to trade more in each other's currencies and lean less on the dollar. And there's been real movement. India buying oil outside the dollar, China and Russia settling trade in yuan, bilateral deals popping up around the world. Each one chips a little flake off the dollar's dominance. There's also gold, the original money, making a quiet comeback. In recent years, central banks around the world have been buying gold at some of the fastest rates in modern history. It's not hard to see why. Gold is the one reserve asset that nobody else can freeze, sanction, or switch off. After watching Russia's reserves vanish with a keystroke, a lot of countries decided they'd like to hold a little more of something that sits in their own vault. So, is the dollar actually falling? A little, at the edges. Its share of global reserves has drifted down over the past couple of decades, from around 70% at the turn of the millennium to somewhere closer to 60% today. That's a real, measurable decline. But notice what it is and what it isn't. It's a slow erosion, not a collapse. The dollar is leaking altitude gently. It is absolutely not falling out of the sky. And here's the crucial point that ties it all together. For the dollar to actually be dethroned, the world doesn't just need to dislike the dollar. It needs a better alternative, a currency that's stable, freely tradable, backed by deep and open financial markets, and trusted enough that everyone is willing to store their national savings in it. Right now, despite all the headlines, no such alternative exists. The challengers each fail at least one of those tests. You can't beat something with nothing. Chapter 8. What happens next? The most likely future, then, isn't a dramatic dollar collapse with some new king crowned overnight. It's something slower and messier, a gradual drift toward a more multipolar world where the dollar is still the biggest player by far, but shares a little more of the field with the euro, the yuan, and gold. Picture the dollar's share sliding from 60% toward 50% over a couple of decades. Still dominant, still the default, but no longer quite so alone at the top. Empires of money, like empires of land, tend to fade gradually, and then, occasionally, all at once. And what does all this mean for an ordinary American? It's a double-edged sword. On one side, the exorbitant privilege is very real. It lets the United States borrow cheaply, import more than it exports, and pay for things in a currency it can print. On the other side, a permanently strong, in-demand dollar makes American exports more expensive and foreign goods cheaper, which, over decades, helped hollow out a chunk of American manufacturing. Remember Triffin? To be the world's banker, you have to run endless deficits. The dollar's global crown has always come with a quiet domestic cost, and that tension isn't going away. So what would actually accelerate the dollar's decline? A few things. If the United States ever defaulted on its debt or let inflation run wild, it would damage the one thing the whole system rests on: trust. If it overused sanctions to the point where staying in the dollar felt more dangerous than leaving, it could push even friendly nations away. The greatest threat to the dollar, in the end, isn't China or the euro or the BRICS. It's the possibility that the United States itself stops being a safe and reliable place to keep the world's money. So how did green pieces of paper take over the world? Through gold, then war, then a hotel in New Hampshire, through a broken promise, a barrel of oil, and a network so deep that no one can afford to leave it. The dollar's reign is one of the most remarkable accidents and engineering feats in economic history, built on power, yes, but ultimately resting on something far more fragile: the world's belief that an American promise is good. As long as that belief holds, the dollar stays on the throne. The day it doesn't is the day this story finally ends. Thanks for watching, and if you learned something, you know what to do.